Perfect.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Looking beautiful.
Beauty. I'm also just going to pull up the chat real quick. So I have that here. All right. So yes, it's nice to see everybody here today. It's my first time kind of seeing everybody as a group. Wow, there's a lot of you. FYI, this is a two-part workshop. So the first part is going to be led by myself. I'm also joined by Jen here, and we're going to be talking about the design of the pitch. The second half is going to be run by Jordan, who is here, and she's going to be focusing on the delivery. So overall, talking about elevating your pitch deck as a whole, design and delivery. So a bit about me. For those who I haven't met yet, I am the creative director of Zoc Studios. We create one-of-a-kind pitch decks. We also work with companies of all sizes, startups to Fortune 500s, and we help them craft visual brand identities. Before this, I worked as a management consultant within banking and financial markets, but yeah, very similar sphere. In fact, even though it's a very different title, it's another realm of creating presentations and communicating strategy. So that has remained as the bread and butter for a lot of the work that I do still. Jen, did you want to give a short intro as well?
Yeah, to say hi to everyone, I'm Jen Batley. I'm a SheBoot investor, coach, Ghost board member. I've had a number of different roles over the last few years. Excited to just join today to provide some investor perspective on the two presentations that we're going to see, and looking forward to it. I've had a sneak peek and there's some really great content in here.
So thanks, Jen. Just before I jump in, I did want to just get a general pulse check of what is everybody's experience with design. So if you just pop open into the chats, maybe you can just type in what your experience is, just a quick low, medium, high, no experience, but have interest, no interest, but have time today for this workshop, whatever the case may be. Oh, nice. Used to be a web designer. Low, okay, no experience, low, have interest. Low, can't even draw a circle. We can work on that. Okay, great. Yeah, I understand not everybody might have a background in design. That's perfectly fine. I do think we all have somewhat of an eye for it, right? Like we see things, we feel like we can either connect to it or not connect to it. I think the only difference really is we might not just have the language for it yet to look at a slide and say, you know, this isn't working because it's not the right contrast or it's not the right hierarchy. And so that's what I hope to provide you all in this session today, is the language to be able to look at your slide and make those adjustments. This is hopefully going to be a session where you get to better quickly, and it's really less of a masterclass of design. I just want to be able to give you some practical tips that you could start running with right away. So let's just jump right into it. Here's what we're going to be covering today. So the big idea, why design matters in a pitch. I'm going to talk about storytelling a little bit, why that's important before you actually get to the design. 3 is the most practical portion, so I'm going to hit you with some tips there. 4, let's talk about some of the tool options that you have. I'll also share some free resources for you. And then the second half of this workshop is really, let's take all the things we would have talked about and let's apply it to some live critiques of some presentations that a few of you have graciously shared with us here today. So let's start here. Okay, the first thing I just want to put out there is don't do this, right? Here's 6 examples of what you don't want to do. I say this just in the context of a pitch. I think for other presentations, financial reports, consulting decks, perfectly fair game. But for a pitch, we just want to keep in mind that I think there's a common set of patterns that are not going to serve us. So there's a lot of text going on. There's so much messaging that you're trying to communicate. The text is so small. You're using so many colors. So just keep in mind, this is what you want to avoid for your pitch deck. And so if you're building a pitch deck for a first time, I would say there's a pretty good chance you're probably Googling examples online and then using those as your North Star. And so commonly you might find Uber, that's a common one that's circulating. Airbnb is another one that I find is very popular that people find. And so I just want to caution you that these are very old, right? As you can see in the title, this is from 2008. These are 2 decades old. And so just like how expectations in any space continue to change and grow, the same goes for the investor space in design in the pitch deck space, right? Jen, maybe you have some experience in seeing some of these changes, or I mean, from your perspective, do you find that the impact of design has an impact on you in terms of when you're considering investment?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think even for investors who are often in the same boat and not experienced designers and maybe don't have the language for design, it's really the impact in how things are being communicated. So when it's clear, when there's a lot less clutter, there's a lot less going on. And when there's there's something on the slide that is complementing the words that you're saying, that makes a big difference. And you can get lost in some of those, the previous slide, I've seen some like that. You get very lost trying to figure out what's on the slide, and your pitch loses impact there.
That's a great point. Having the words match what you're saying, I feel like goes a long way. And so, here are some examples, I think, of what a few well put together slides might look like. Of course, they do not have to look like these. To be fair, these were created with the help of hired hands, right? But they should just share something in common, which is that your message is translated pretty much instantaneously via the design, and it's easy to understand what's going on, right? So I just want the quick takeaway here is just to keep in mind what relevant starts to look like in 2023. I also want us to challenge our perception that we might have that design is very much about beautifying something or covering something up. I think a useful way for us to look at it is more as a tool. Again, you want to save time in what you're saying while you still have someone's attention, right? So if you do it well, you're also building that trust and that credibility along the way. If I put this slide up, how long are you realistically going to be looking at this, right? 5 seconds, maybe 10 max, right? Maybe you're not even looking at it anymore. And that's fair, because I think the slides are just there to capture your attention. They're never really going to do the job of sustaining it. And so I just want to put this fact in front of you. This is a research done by a company I believe called DocSend, where they looked across 200 pitch decks, and they looked at how long does an investor on average spend on these pitch decks, flipping through from beginning to end. And they spend 4 minutes, only 4 minutes from beginning to end looking at it. And so if you think about a pitch having about 15 to 20 slides, really per slide, they're looking at it for 15 seconds, right? So that's 15 seconds for you to make the impact that you want to make. So that's sort of the big idea for how you can start to think about using design. Let me just pause there to see if anyone has any questions.
Okay. I have a question.
Yeah.
So given that they spend such a little amount of time reviewing the decks at the start, would you advise to have less slides being sent before, or still keep with the 15 to 20?
I think you would, I would prefer to send the full deck so they have the full set of context, because there might be investors who are particularly interested in knowing the market size, or you might have investors interested in knowing your roadmap. So you want to have all the pieces there so it's full. But what you might want to do is send a skimmed down version. So a very pared down version where you're eliminating a lot of the details that are actually on the slide itself.
Thanks.
No worries. Hey, Karen.
Hi. So just a quick question. So I've been focusing on, like, for the pitch to do very minimal text, like more visuals, right? Like, cause I want them to listen to me rather than read my slides. But if they're going to poke around in the deck, or if they get the deck, I actually want it to have more content because I'm not going to be talking. So is it almost good to have a deck that has more content that would be for them to review without the pitch, and then the pitch itself could be more visual as opposed to text heavy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's multiple ways of doing this. There is sometimes companies have two versions of their decks. There's the skimmed down version, which is exactly as you mentioned, the presentation one that has just mainly the visuals. And then there's what you call the send along. So either sending it before or after. The deck after should have all the details that you've covered in your presentation. That includes more notes on the voiceovers that you would have provided. So essentially,
it can have more slides in it, even the one that's sent to them.
It can have more slides, but be careful that you might not want to bulk the core deck. You might just want to pull those slides into the appendix.
Okay.
So they have it available, but it's not gonna bloat your main story.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting challenge because you've got this situation where some investors like to receive something ahead of the pitch, and you have your pitch, and then often there's follow-up and balancing whether it's 2 versions or 3 versions. But sometimes you do want to communicate more information than what your pitch deck, your presentation deck will communicate. So like she said, moving some of that heavy detail to an appendix slide, or just being very thoughtful about what you send ahead, because sometimes it's helpful to set context and sometimes it can actually be confusing or overwhelming for the investor at that pre-raid stage, especially.
Great. Okay. So when it comes to leaving a lasting impression, one of the ways you can think about doing that is through storytelling. I will say the visual design of the presentation will only ever be as strong as the message it's already trying to tell. And so you might have already heard the term storytelling being thrown around. I feel like in the creative industry, it's become such a buzzword, but the only thing you really need to know is it's just about having a point of view. So for instance, if we take this as an example, this is the market opportunity slide. So here's the information as it is, right? There's a large opportunity in RV transportations. The addressable market size within North America is $2.5 billion. It's informative, it is factual, but I would contest that it is not exactly giving a point of view. It might be better served if you communicate why you think the market is a worthwhile one, or the insights you have as to how you might capture it. I think at the end of the day, our brains are less built just for remembering data. Our brains are built for remembering stories, and we actually just chunk the data inside of those stories, and that's how data gets remembered. And so, for instance, if we want to tell this in 3 different ways, one way might be a story about growth. So you want to show that the market you're in is not just a big one, but it's a growing one. And you might say, you know, today it's a $1 billion market. 7 years from now, it's 10 times that. 5 years from there, it's ballooning up 15 times from there, right? So you want to prove that your market is not just a stagnant one, nor are you just catching a current wave or a trend. So for instance, during COVID, there was a lot of examples of this where demand for health-related devices or solutions were on the rise. And then as soon as we saw the vaccines come out, we saw, you know, the demand for those started to plateau. So I think investors are interested in less your projections for the next year or two, but you've thought about the long-term horizon of where the opportunity is going to be a decade out, 2 decades out. Another way that you might be interested to tell the story is around timing. So for instance, we know that there is a ton of money in healthcare. I know a lot of you have created products in healthcare, either on the software side, the hardware side, or both. But if you compare it to the sizes of these other industries that are already disrupted or already digitized, it helps to put the urgency into context. So really, without needing to say it, this visual starts to answer the question of, okay, why now do we exist? It's saying there's an opportunity to disrupt this space that's already ripe for it. The other industries have already been digitized. Healthcare is the last remaining one. There's money, and so it's the right time to do this. Another way you might tell the story is a story of innovation. So if you're in the position where you are actually not tapping into an existing market, but you believe you're creating a new one, then you might want to anchor it into markets that already exist. So in this case, there's a market for concerts, there's a market for live streaming, but you've identified this opportunity that lies in the middle, and you have the ability to capture a bit of both of these markets. So that's just a quick example of how you can begin thinking about turning just a slide of facts into more of a story with a point of view. This is, just the market opportunity slide, but I would consider having this thought throughout each slide in your presentation so that every single slide is compelling and has some sort of perspective to it. Again, quick pause before I move on to the next section. Any questions about that or any thoughts so far? Okay. All right. So let's get down to it. What are some practical tips you could start applying right away, right? Remember, you have 15 seconds per slide. What can you do? The first thing you can consider is consistency. This is by far the easiest hack to creating a professional clean deck every time, because anything that is not consistent tends to be very distracting. The first thing we can consider here is the font you're using. So there's generally two kinds. There's sans serif, which are all the logos you see on the left, right? These evoke like a minimal, clean, modern, friendly brand association, whereas the serif fonts on the right are more reserved for these traditional legacy, luxurious brands. And so you want to be able to just be mindful of the associations between these two fonts. I assume for the most part, a lot of you are already using sans serif fonts because you're a new business, you're doing something new for the first time. But I just want to put this thought in your head that if you're ever transitioning to, say, a more exclusive clientele or a more elite clientele, then you might want to think about using the serif fonts, whether that's in your presentation, on your website, as a company logo. You might want to consider that. But, early days, we're still in the pitch. So another thing when it comes to fonts that you might want to keep in mind is to restrict the number of font sizes in your presentation, right? So my rule of thumb typically is keep between 3 to 4 sizes. The first two can be bigger, so you might want to reserve these for your titles, your subtitles. The other two can be smaller, so reserving that for the main content of your slide, as well as any smaller footer text or little data labels for your charts, things like that. Keep between 3 and 4, and remember to use them consistently. So across all 15 to 20 slides of your deck. I know that sounds like it might be a small detail, and it might not be something that the eye can even detect, but I guarantee you it's these little things that you practice over time, and that's what builds a deck that looks organized. This is just a picture I took at, I don't know if anybody has been to the Art Gallery of Ontario. I'm based in Toronto, so I'm there all the time. This is just a picture to say, again, let's not do this, guys. There's a lot of sizes, there's a lot of fonts, and we're smiling because we don't even want to see this. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Consistent placements. We're talking about titles here. We're talking about footers. Again, try to keep these in the same place every single slide. It's as easy as copying and pasting them on every slide. We just want to make sure that when we go slide by slide, there is no jittering of these objects. Again, because they're a little distracting and they pull away from focus on you just a little bit every time. Consistent styles. So, every founder here already has a website, which is great. It's a great starting spot to be able to pull in colors you're already using, pull in icons, pull in illustrations. We want to basically make sure that there is some congruency between the website and your presentation, because investors will dance around these things, right? They'll check one thing out, then the next, and you just want to make sure you're keeping your brand up to date. And so what not to do is the bottom is just some examples of if you're using icons and they're 3D, don't use an outline one on the next slide. You know, keep it consistent. If you're using a 3D illustration, don't use a flat one on the next slide. Keep it consistent. And then on the topic of colors, I think a number of us already have these associations we make when we look at colors. They're often very shared associations. Industries as a whole tend to stick to colors that they're already associated with. So for instance, in tech, you see a ton of blue. Maybe we're all sick of seeing blue by now, but it's there because it communicates trust and security, and these are all the values that's shared within the industry, right? Crypto, it's black. That's why none of us trust it. Well, at least I don't trust it. So we just want to be mindful, you know your industry, do a little research. What colors do you find are commonplace? You probably want to play within those guidelines. Another thing I want to highlight is cultural significance. So for instance, I was working with a real estate company that was producing green tech. So they were in the business of being green, and yet they were in Germany. And so they had let me know that the color green in Germany is often associated with these very value brands that pride themselves on being affordable, which they definitely did not see themselves as. And so it's this interplay of knowing, what does the color mean in your industry? And also, what does this color mean in your culture as a whole, or the culture of the people that you're going to be targeting? So you just want to be mindful of what colors mean to different groups of people as well. Okay, the second design principle here is hierarchy, right? So if we flash your slide just for 1 second on the screen, what is that takeaway going to be? And that is really what I mean when I say hierarchy. So for instance, here's a way to show some key metrics. You can bold them, you can make them stand out by using color, you can up the size. This format is very common for financial-based slides. You don't have to show every figure in the table. That is better left for the due diligence process or the data room. You just need to show the top level key traction figures. And this is also something that I might have as an option as the hook. So as the second slide following the cover, you might just show these impressive figures if you got them, and use that as the hook as well. That's another case you might be able to use these. If you're showing a roadmap or a timeline, you could also use hierarchy to have a particular moment pop. Again, we're using font sizes, we're using colors just to call attention to the most important thing on the slide. It might not always be the product launch you want to highlight. You want to think about the specific milestones that investors would be interested to see. And then to take it a step further, so we go from this to this, you could also think about dimming the moments on the timeline that aren't as important, because timelines often are the slide that appear the most cluttered. There's a lot you've done, and you want to be able to show that. But you also might want to dim because everything before today might not be the focus of your conversation for the pitch. But you do want them there to acknowledge that you had accomplishments before this moment, right? So it's about emphasizing the right things if you've got a lot to show on the slide. Third principle, we are at simplicity. There are blocks of text that sometimes appear on a slide. We all know it might read as a little boring in a presentation. So in the beginning of a pitch, I've seen sometimes decks that do start out like this, right? Give the slide a read. I feel like the chances are you've already stopped. And why is that? Is because short presentations, or I should say short paragraphs, they ask someone to do more labor than they're used to in the context of a presentation. So I think realistically, you start to read it, you start skimming, and then you just overlook the whole thing. So instead of doing this, just think about what is the takeaway you want to leave someone with. So I would argue the takeaway is really just there's 3 barriers in healthcare. It's inefficient, it lacks diversity, and it's fragmented, right? So just try categorizing it and then leave the details underneath in smaller size. And that then becomes optional for someone to read if they're interested to dive into the next level. Another tip here is people don't come to hear you speak. People do come to hear you speak. They don't come to read. And so we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but if the slide is actually saying more than you are saying, then they're going to be reading instead of listening to you, right? On the flip side, because this is not a one size fits all, so there's a flip side to this. Sometimes it is worthwhile to have key pieces of information on the slide itself. And that can get a little bit confusing to differentiate. What should I have on the slide versus what should I keep for my voiceover? Jen, and this is very much a subjective experience I recognize from the investor's point of view, but I guess from your point of view, is there anything that might come to mind that you find valuable to actually have up on the slide?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on obviously those key, there's key numbers or key differentiators that you want to make sure the investors not just hear, but visually take away, that matters. When there are some critical details, if you're making really core assumptions that are influencing the numbers you're showing or the roadmap that you're showing, if there's something sort of fundamental that's underlying the bigger statement you're making, I think it's okay to have some of that text on there. Again, I think you want to keep that as short as you can. and it doesn't need to be paragraphs. It should still be sort of clear, short statements. If you're in a situation, at least this is my experience, if there's a place where you really want to go deep and there's a lot of assumptions or it's something more complex, I think that's where having a supplemental slide that you can go to if the conversation seems to take you there, if you're getting questions and you really feel like you need to be able to show a kind of that next level down of information, then that's a place to do that. I think one thing, and this it touches on the themes of both consistency and simplicity, you really have to remember, especially in a situation where you're pitching in a group of pitches, you have to remember that the investors, we're new to your business, we're new to your story, we're new to the impact you're trying to have. You have to be very crisp and clean and really have a straightforward message, both in your speaking and in what's showing up on the slide. And I think she really hit it. Like if you're making us work too hard, we're getting tired, we're getting overwhelmed, and we're not listening to what you're saying.
Yeah, great ads. Remember, the appendix is free for you to fill up to your heart's content. That's the piece that you can run a little bit wild with that extra bit of info. Just remember to keep it in the appendix if it is that extra detail you want to drill down to later in your conversations. It's a great point, Jen.
I think I would add, even in the appendix, I've seen pitch decks that are, the front piece might be in that 15 to 20 slides, but then there's 60 or 70 more in the appendix. That's too much. So some of that probably needs to wait for due diligence. So even though you have an opportunity to share more, you still want to be selective and specific in why are you including some of the information that you're including, and is it really going to be helpful to helping the investor understand versus just adding a lot of depth and complexity that isn't really going to make a difference to taking the next step from the initial pitch.
Great point. Also, in the name of simplicity, we might want to consider skipping the jargon. you're all experts in the particular spaces that you're in. And I think with that territory sometimes comes language that the rest of us find a little bit foreign. And so we just want to be mindful of simplifying some of that language. There's some examples there, but another case that this might show up is if there are acronyms that your specific industry uses, you might just want to spell those out, at least for the first time that they show up in your presentation, until people get familiar with them. Another thing you could do is pull the bottom line up front, right? And this is in reference to the slide titles. So if you have a slide talking about financials, you can push beyond that. Like, you can get a little bit more expressive so that the takeaway is very clear. This is an example of how you can reframe it, but you could do this for every slide. Like if you have a competition slide, you can say, instead of competition, you could say there's no direct competitors in this industry with high barriers to entry. You basically just want to pull your conclusions up, because as soon as you flip to that side, someone's going to read the title, they're going to understand your point, and then they're going to focus back on you instead of trying to decipher everything else that's going on. We touched on this a little bit already, but in a 10-15 minute pitch, you want to keep it tight in slide count. And the way that you can see if you're doing that appropriately is to time yourself speaking to every slide, because realistically, you want it to fall between 30 to 60 seconds. If it's beyond 60 seconds, that's an indication that you're packing too many ideas into that one slide, or perhaps the idea is so big that it's worth just chunking out into smaller pieces. So yeah, just a quick recap. We talked about consistency, hierarchy, and simplicity for design principles. I'm taking a look at the time now, and I want to make sure we get to the critique. So I'm going to skip this because I think everybody already has a chosen tool. If you want to talk tools, let's chat outside of this, but I think we all feel set in this department. Just a couple of resources. Pitch is the last tool on the list from before. They offer a number of presentation templates. It's fantastic if you want to get started with your sales deck, marketing deck, product launch deck, whatever kind of decks you're thinking of. They probably have it in their template. Pitch also is a resource where they had an initiative where they led a female founded startups initiative. So there's 50 pitch decks in there for you to reference if you're looking for some more references. Nounproject.com. This is a free resource if you're looking for icons to use. I'm just rolling through these quickly because I know it's being recorded, so you can always check the recording back for this. There is Pixels. So there's Pixels is great for photography. You probably aren't going to be using that much photography in your pitch deck. The only time that you really can consider it is if you're trying to sell a lifestyle. So for instance, I was doing a pitch where it was for a company that was essentially the Airbnb of RVs. Just use a couple photos to sell the lifestyle of adventure without needing to spell it out in words. You might consider doing the same for your company if you're a lifestyle company. And then finally, there's just Draw Kit on Draw. This is free illustration that you could use. Again, you could probably don't want to bulk your slides with these. Maybe you want to use it for the cover, the ending, the problem. Try to keep these off more data heavy slides like your roadmap or your financials. Okay, I realized I covered a lot in a short amount of time, but I definitely do want to bridge the gap and start putting this into practice. So I'm going to switch gears now and just jump right into the live critique. Let me just pause. Any questions, by the way, so far? Nope, we're feeling good.
I think
Nope,
there
we-
is one, Yushel.
Hi, Chief. Great presentation, and it's always just so informative to see it all come together. My question is more so just well, from the investor perspective, because what I really liked you did in your slide was there was no title and there was just text. But when you're pitching, I mean, we're meant to hit certain criteria, and we talked about this earlier. So how, from an investor perspective and from the perspective of pitching in a competition, if we remove our titles altogether and just have key messages, would that create more confusion, or is that not recommended? what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. I would say if you're pitching in a scenario where you're being judged based on a rubric, then you want those titles present. So you're clearly saying, I'm checking all these boxes. So what I would do is if it is a competitor slide, you have the word competition in very, very, very small font, right? And then underneath in larger font, you can write out your statement. So you're covering both, but you're emphasizing the takeaway.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would sorry, Jane. I was going to add,
Okay.
I think from my perspective as an investor, especially when you're doing a more of a judged evaluation, it just helps situate you. Again, sometimes it's very obvious what's on the slide, but don't make us work harder than we need to figure out which topic you're covering.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add it. You talked about the competition slides, and I've noticed just in all the pitch practices that I've been attending, that's one slide that a lot of folks seem to have some trouble with because there's so much to say, of course. And I've heard some of you here have received conflicting feedback from the judges. Like some say, oh, put it in the table. Others have said, take that out of a table, put it. So I don't know if it might be helpful for the group because that's a tricky one, right? Sometimes it's a table and you're checking boxes as to what your advantages are over the others. I'm not sure, it's kind of very specific to one area, but because it is fairly complex, I don't know if there's any more to add on that. I see a few nodding heads, so I think I've been in your pitch sessions where you've received that feedback.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely toss this one out to the group as well, because I think there might be differing opinions upon this. I would say if we are using a table format, sometimes people list out the benefits in terms of features. So they're comparing direct features of the product rather than what should be shown is more at the benefits level. So bring it up a level. So instead of just showing feature sets, show it at the value of the benefits. And that's really your differentiation in terms of your value, because anybody can just start adding features to their products. But if you're doing something completely special in terms of adding a value or a benefit that the other competitors aren't, then you probably do want to call that out. Are there other styles of competition type slides, Jen, that you've seen that you really feel like resonate? Because there's also the question of how many competitors should I be listing, right? Sometimes you have 30. Do you show all 30? Do you show the top 5? What's preferred?
Yeah, I think some of that depends on the market and the product as well. I mean, you don't need to show every competitor, in my opinion, but you also don't want to mask if the marketplace is crowded, and it's likely that the investor will be able to figure that out. And so you don't want to pretend like it's not, but maybe you're just highlighting your differentiation against some of the key competitors or some of the ones that maybe are maybe mistakenly compared most often to you. And I think the other thing, and I've had several conversations about this lately, is making sure you're clear when you're talking about your competition. Sometimes there's a difference between who investors will have in their mind as your competitors and sort of but maybe adjacent companies or companies that are bringing a comparable kind of feature or function set to market, but maybe in a different space, as opposed to who you're competing against when you're actually going to market and trying to win business. And the example that I came across most recently was a company who, when they go out to sell, really what they're displacing is pen and paper. But when they're pitching to investors really struggle with that. They want to know, but who are the other like companies, even though in their space, there really isn't a direct competitor yet. There's one other small startup. But when you don't situate investors, then they started to go to a lot of quite large companies in this case that are kind of close, but really not doing the same thing. And so in that case, the founder did themselves a disservice by not showing enough of the competition or not speaking to it through the lens of the investor.
Yes, Tana.
So hi, thank you for the great presentation. So I'm struggling here with the storytelling. We are developing a smart injector for diabetes patients. So I received some feedback that it would be good to add some personal touch. So I started about talking about my family and the problems they faced. But then I received the feedback that's too much of describing the problem. So everyone knows about diabetes, just try to cut some part of it out. So I don't know how much is too much. How much should I share about the problem? Maybe could you please just give me some advice?
So I can start on that too. And I think the first thing to say is every person who sees your pitch will have some different feedback for you. So part of what's great about doing a lot of pitch practice is you start to hear all those things and you can listen for what are the themes that are coming up. And then, but eventually you need to get to a place where you have really strong conviction in the story that you're telling. So I think to me, it sounds like you're at the point where maybe it was a little too cold or impersonal, and you may have gone too far into the storytelling. And so you can right size that to share kind of your personal motivation behind what you're building, but not dwell on in an example like yours where that problem is fairly clear. Yeah, I don't think you need to go into that in a lot of detail.
Perfect, thank you.
Jen? Okay, any other questions before I jump into the critique? Okay. Katie, feel free to keep me honest. I know we want to also have a short break, and I want to be mindful of that. So feel free to, jump in and let me know when we're at time.
Okay, great. I will.
Okay, awesome. So for the critique, here's what we'll do. Well, let's look at a handful of slides and let's just have a discussion around what you think is working, what's confusing, what do you think could be adjusted? And then I'll have a chance to show you how we can actually make these edits in the tool itself. So we could just start with this one. This is Payel. I hope I'm saying that correctly. This is Payel's company, Yo GPS. And so this is just a cover slide. So any first initial thoughts? What's working well? What's confusing? What might be adjusted? Yeah, feel free to just unmute and jump right in.
I really like the visuals. I think that it gives a clear understanding of, there are the vehicles, there's different kinds of vehicles, there's a little GPS tracker logo. Everybody or most people would know what that little symbol means. So I think that that's very intuitive. And then she's got the map as well. So again, very intuitive to understand what she's offering.
Agreed. Great use of visuals. I like the product straight away. With the visuals, I will add that I really enjoy how you can see the different channels it's being offered as well. One of the challenges to keep in mind, not for this visual, but for future visuals, is that we never know what screen anybody's on. So someone might be using a 13-inch laptop screen. And so things tend to shrink when things are too small. And so if we're using a visual where there are multiple screens, just make sure that you can actually read the text that's inside or the images that's inside. Another thing I'll say with the cover is it is such an important slide in the pitch because often if you're presenting virtually, you might have it up on the screen as you're getting organized, as you're doing intros. So it's up there at least for a few couple minutes. You want to start off with, a strong first impression. One way you can do that if you've already got a site up is try to mimic the style to your site. So for instance, this is Yo GPS's site today is great. There's a distinct style that's happening. We see the waves, we see the gradients, we see the device. And so what would happen if we brought that into the presentation? It might start to look something like this. We introduce that congruency. We're making the tagline pop up front. Here we can use the image from before, or we can borrow the one from the landing page. What I like about the one from the landing page is that it also demonstrates the hardware side of it, which is, 50 or at least some percentage of the solution. So maybe that is worth highlighting as well. let's just jump into another slide. This is the elevator pitch, or rather the about us slide. Very common to start with this. Yeah, any immediate thoughts? What's working well? What's missing? What can be adjusted?
I'm wondering if the title is actually
One
needed.
of them, and it can get us.
Great
I
point.
think there's a lot more text on this one that I kind of give a cursory glance to and then ignore.
So we want it to be scannable to some degree.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
almost like you want to take the design and just have the words sitting next to them, like instead of the little paragraph there or the point form.
So we want to simplify some of the text in the process. That could be a way to improve it. Yeah. So let's take a look. I'm going to duplicate it so we have a before and after. So first we said maybe elevator pitch is self-evident, right? Maybe it doesn't even need to be there. Between this text and this text, it feels approximately the same size, but I heard that really this piece of text feels secondary. So why don't we start by bumping up the most important piece of information here? Next, I heard that there's an opportunity to simplify some of this text, right? So it says, we are designed to track all moving assets, including trucks, cars, boats, machinery, which I might argue is already communicated in this image here. You've got all these assets shown. So maybe it's not worthwhile to duplicate that. You're left with this bullet list, which on its own might not provide you with enough information. What is this list referring to? And so maybe we just want to add a little title to this, which are, here are the benefits, right?
I'd suggest they could be more action oriented too, like improve productivity, reduce costs, safeguard against that, like versus improving. Yeah.
Yeah, action words. And then we just want to, clean this up grammatically, make sure everything is makes sense. And so, I know very tiny fixes so far, but if we just compare before and after, it does come across a little bit quicker, the information that you're looking for. Just a little bit quicker. Let's take a look at the milestones chart. Okay, first impressions. And maybe this is interesting to capture from Jen's view as well. So from an investor's lens, there's a roadmap. What are you hoping to take away quickly when you look at a roadmap?
I think that's a great question. For me, I'm looking for what has the progression of the company been, or where are they going? But really significant achievements or accomplishments along the pathway. When I look at this, there are some there, but there's a lot of words on here. And so it makes it hard. And this might be one where maybe it builds to add words as you're talking about it. But at first glance, it's hard to actually follow the progression because there's so much that my eyes are jumping around to. And I think maybe a smaller detail for me on the two pieces that have more text on the top, I'd actually prefer to see those main headers or whatever the key piece of information is closer to the timeline itself. So I can just look across that timeline and pick up the core story. And then if there are details, they can be smaller and like I said, maybe they build, or ideally there's just less of them.
So to Jen's point, maybe pulling up the theme of the years, so they're all organized at the top. We are, different roadmaps serve different purposes. So if you're focused on R&D, your roadmap might be exploring feature sets. It might focus on that. If you got your product dialed in, maybe you're focusing on the financial side of things. If you know you're going to raise further rounds, you might bring that in. I think in this situation, there's a lot of information. And so while a lot of it is valuable, we might think about just categorizing them out. So for instance, we might think about doing something like this. So pulling all those headlines to the top, we are separating out. So we're talking about revenue, market focus, enhancements, and grants. to Jen's point again, maybe there is still too much on this slide and we want to let it build. So maybe the first slide, you just show revenue, flip to the next slide, you're adding the line on market focus and you're building it out that way. So we just want to make sure that the principle of this is let people find what they're looking for in the less amount of time possible. And so give them the option to choose where they want to go with it instead of having to scan all the text and figure it out for themselves, right? Okay, let's jump to this thank you slide. This is a thank you slide comment. You know, everyone seems to always write thank you. Everyone's very kind, very grateful. I think this is also a fairly key slide in the sense that it might be up on the screen while you're having your discussion after the fact. It might be up on the screen because you want to jump between slides as you're having your Q&A. And so how can we make the most of this? I think Payal has done a great job here of showing this image of where her customers are, how dense they are across North America. What are some other things you might be able to do if you don't have a visual like this? You might want to recap some of the key accomplishments you would have talked about. So pulling some of those numbers in. You might also just want to reinforce the final takeaway. So how much are you raising? What's the runway? And just listing some of the goals you plan to accomplish. Again, these are repeated facts, but they're going to be up there because they're going to be the things that hopefully will be memorable for the investor to take away. We're also, as you notice, on a visual side, matching the cover that we've done earlier. I like to think of presentations like they're bookending. So the beginning and end can match to signal the close of that. And again, it just helps to keep you stay consistent in terms of the style that you're using in your presentation.
Sorry, I would just add, just to reinforce that comment, I think that landing slide is a slide that gets overlooked a lot in presentations, and as that last example showed, it can really be a tool to communicate and reinforce those key points. And it's more, I think people think of it as I just need something at the end, so I can signal that I'm done, and actually it should be where your most critical messages are left.
Are there any, by the way, that are top of mind, Jen, that you've seen, or decks that are memorable where you think, yeah, that last slide really was helpful in terms of it hammered these things home for me?
To be honest, no. And that's I think it's a big missed opportunity.
All right, one worth capturing. Okay, we have a slide here from scriptstring.ai. This is a use case slide. So typically use cases, you can compile a number of these, so then you can swap them in and out depending on the audience you want to appeal to. So for this use case slide, again, I'll just open this up to the group. What appears to be working well? What might be simplified?
I'll share. For me, the color and the industry is very clear. It's very consistent, and to your point earlier, I would say trusted as a result because it aligns with what overall the company's trying to communicate in the space that they're in. So yeah, and I really a huge thing for me is alignment. So I really like how cleanly aligned the slide is, and I like the visually that's satisfying for my eye.
I would say just make certain highlights pop more. Like the 80% plus reduction in annual expenditures. I think that those are key things that you can maybe make them bolder, or in terms of size, make them come out and really capture your attention.
Yeah, draw the eyes to the outcomes, which are arguably the most important takeaways in a use case slide like this. Exactly. And agreed, Katie, I think the alignment is great here. It looks very professional. It's organized. The color scheme, everything appears to match. So I think it's done a great job. How I might push it just a little bit further is exactly as was mentioned. I might consider some headlines just to separate the content out a little bit more. Because it's a use case and we might have multiple use cases, we want to almost templatize it so it's easy for someone to go in, edit the text, and it's already polished. Here, what I've done, and you've noticed from the previous slide that the text runs from left to right, almost covering the full slide. There is this tendency that when you're dragging your eyes that far along, it tends to feel like you're beginning to almost read a book. So keeping text boxes short will help with the sustaining the attention. There's also another thing called Z pattern. Don't know if anyone's familiar with that already, but it's this idea that when you look at something, your eyes move from top left to right, back down to the right. So that's naturally where the eyes will go. And so when we organize information in this way, the story is told in a more logical fashion. We've also, as someone was mentioning before, how do you indicate the title without using the title? Here's one way I would do it, just use case in a smaller font, and then the takeaway as the larger title. And then maybe
Looks great.
Yeah. Sylvia, this is your deck.
Yeah, it's mine. Yeah, it looks great. I love it.
Awesome. Awesome. Let's do one more from script string, actually. One more. Okay, so this is the company traction slide. What do we think? What are our initial thoughts?
I think the text is a little small. They've accomplished quite a bit, and that could be popped in some way.
We're talking about the highlights here can be emphasized more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, I would say like bridge the highlights with the actual projection, because I feel like this looks more, the graph, sorry, the chart looks more like past. It's like feels outdated compared to what you're trying to achieve.
So linking the highlights, potentially linking the highlights directly on the graph itself.
And then changing the style of the chart. Yeah, maybe a different chart would be helpful.
Well, one question I have, in my natural curiosity when I look at a slide like this, is I'm reading into the fact that between 2021 and 2023, the sales projection was at a fairly consistent level, and then it begins to accelerate next year and beyond. So that's a question I have immediately that might be worth using the title to explain why that is. Maybe some of that information is found in the highlights, but again, if we just make that pop up front, it'll be easier and quicker to understand.
So I have a question. So we did a pivot, and it was about from services to product. And I know somebody mentioned, talk about that. Would this be the place where I would talk about that?
Yeah, great question. So what I might do is, actually, let me answer your question in one moment, because it'll come naturally as I make the adjustment here. So the first thing I would do for this slide is, with the chart itself, it's a good chart. We all use charts like this, but another extra step is just to declutter a little bit. We can remove the y-axis, we can remove the lines if we have the actual data on the bars itself. So how that might look is if we bring in a chart like this. And then there was mention that, the highlights correspond to the chart, but they feel a little bit separated from it. So how might we tie it more directly into the chart? We might just call it out, guide the audience to say, this year, this happened, this year, this happened. And so Sylvia, to your question, if you have had a switch and that's what's influencing your projections, you might be able to add that detail along these guides that we've now created on top of the chart.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
I would just add from the investor perspective, and I had a chance to see this slide before today, and this version speaks to me much more clearly. And I think to your question, Sylvia, that split between the recurring revenue and the services revenue, you're definitely going to get questions about that. And so just bumping that, I know the bars are clearly labeled, but bumping that 80-20 MRR versus services up front makes it very clear kind of what that distinction is and gives you that springboard to talk about that as a pivot and maybe the pace of growth of the recurring piece relative to services and where you're going there, and just clear some of those concerns off the table for investors.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say one thing, the use of the bold here, the colors and the sizing makes a huge difference in being able to absorb the information. On an unrelated note, too, we have about 5 more minutes. So
Okay.
we'll just keep that in mind.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that, Katie. Maybe we have time for just one more slide, and then we'll wrap up. So the last slide that we can take a look at is this final slide, the closing slide. We all have slides like this. Any initial thoughts from the group? Again, working well, could be simplified, might be adjusted.
Yeah, maybe a different graphic where it's like showcasing that, like maybe a full circle of like all the things that you'll be doing, or bridging the investment or the icons a bit larger.
Maybe balancing the left and the right side a little bit.
Yep, great. So a suggestion is maybe a pie chart to represent the use of funds in a way that's quantifiable. Balance, definitely. I also share those thoughts where when I look at this, I feel like the word investment is just as important as all 6 things on the right. The most important takeaway on the ask slide is often, what are you seeking? And, how much runway, right? 15 months runway. So I would say that is normally the most important takeaway. So we want to make that evident with the size and the weight of the text itself. What I think is working really well, though, is the choice of icons here. I think it makes the text easier to scan, the points easier to scan and pick up on what's going on. So we want to keep those. I think bolding the text is another great choice to make the emphasizes that we want to make. Again, when we read this, we see there's sentences in a presentation. It's fair game to eliminate those sentences, just go with phrases, right? Just very quickly, as noted before, alignment plays a big role to, having something look a little bit more organized. So we might want to just fix the alignment a little bit there. And then on the right, this is 4 things in a list, but under what? So we want to just add a little bit of a label here, use of funds. We might want to convert this into a pie chart if we know that breakdown, but with the information here, a quick fix is, creating that balance, labeling information that is related, but you're not sure how, and making it clear what the takeaway is. I'm sure I used up those 5 minutes just now, but thank you for everybody here joining today. I really love the participation. I've seen a few of your decks already, and I can really tell there's been a lot of care and attention you've put into these. I would just say for anybody who is interested to share their deck with me or to connect one-on-one, I believe Katie shared my booking link. So thank you so much, Katie. And yeah, I hope to see some more of you all soon.
Thank you, Chi. That was fantastic. And yes, we have Chi's contact and booking link available in your email. It's also already posted on Circle, and so you all have that opportunity. And know that Chi is available to support you, of course, in preparation for the Investor Pitch Day and then our Grand Pitch event, but also all the way up until March. So as things evolve, you can lean on her for a certain number of hours, of course, but those details are included in your email. So thank you so much, Chi. Jen, I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to add before we take our 5-minute break and then get into the next portion of the workshop.
No, I just, I think all of those things, sometimes we don't think enough about those little pieces and how much they matter, and they really do make a difference. So things like consistent font sizes maybe aren't a big deal. And when you're trying to do so many other things in your business, it's easy to lose sight of them. But taking a few minutes to just do a real pass through of your pitch deck, even when you think it's done, and look for those minor details, it can have a lot of impact. The other thing I would say is she showed us there are a lot of tools out there that can help with this, which is great. You want to find the balance between making sure that your deck looks professional, is presenting your messages in the right way without going overboard, right? You're not mostly design professionals, so you want your deck to look professional and present well, but not overinvest your time in it either.
Great point. Don't be like me and become obsessive over every little piece of every design, because you can spend many hours down a rabbit hole. Okay, so we're going to start our 5-minute break now. I'll put the timer on as per usual and call you guys back. Just recognize that there is a link to a resource that's important for the next portion of our session. So everyone said thank you, which is very sweet. Scroll up a little bit, and I've dropped the PDF in the chat, as well as shared a link actually to the file, which has already been uploaded to the share folder. Also, I wanted to flag, just for anybody that is, always refers back to the recordings. We won't be recording, much like our leadership session, we won't be recording the next half of today's workshop. So take your notes if you must. But yeah, okay, so I'll start the timer now, and bring your snacks if you need to too.